Last time, we saw the Axis begin to retreat as supplies became critical. Despite Italian insistence that Gazala could be held, Rommel fell back even further. Now, it looks as though the British will cut off the Axis retreat like they did during Operation Compass the year before. Doing so will result in the destruction of the army and perhaps the end of the North African campaign. Will the British succeed? Will the Axis fall? And what happened? Seriously, what happened? Why did Operation Crusader end up the way that it did? What was the most important factor for this accidental victory? And who's to blame for how everything turned out? This is the final episode, and we're going to go out with a bang. Let's find out why. Notes and sources are in the pinned comment, timestamps to various parts of the video are in the description. At the frontier, de Villers wisely broke off Borain's attack. He then prepared, with Norrie's support, a larger attack consisting of his whole division. In addition, Villers would have the 8th and 44th Royal Tank Regiments of Watkins 1st Army Tank Brigade, the New Zealand Divisional Cavalry Regiment, and a host of artillery battalions in support. On the 19th of December, Marriott was ordered to pass south of Tengada. One detachment went towards the landing ground at Massus, while another was ordered to go through Skeladima towards Gemines. The main body of Marriott's unit, at least what was left of it, was to move to the area southwest of Antalat. So yes, this brigade was overstretched to say the least. 7th Indian Brigade reached Derna and then, owing to a lack of fuel, left its transport and proceeded onwards on foot, trying to keep pressure on the enemy. The 5th Indian Infantry Brigade's advance was delayed by bad weather, and the 7th Support Group slowly made its way towards Taruba, again despite the bad weather and a lack of petrol. The good news for the Germans was that 22 brand new Panzers were delivered to Benghazi by the merchant ship Ankara. Half of these were Panzer IIIs, and other ships were arriving at Tripoli as well, delivering more Panzers, which were now working their way towards the front. Yes, 2 ships were sunk in the Mediterranean along with their 45 Panzers, but it was clear that Rommel's troops were actually getting stronger at this point. The British, on the other hand, were suffering from major supply issues, not helped by the fact that the Axis frontier garrisons continued to hold out. So yes, it seems that the logistical tables were turning. But by this point, the Axis frontier forces weren't in great shape, having been split in 2. The Bardia sector had 2,200 Germans, mostly admin guys, and 6,600 Italian troops, all under the command of German Major General Arthur Schmidt. At the Halfaya sector, the troops were compressed into the area between the Halfaya Pass and Sollum. Major General D. Georgis commanded the men here, which consisted of the remains of his Savona division, 4,200 Italians at this point, and there were 2,100 Germans as well, under the command of Major Bach. When Rommel made his dash to the wire, his men had taken the frontier supplies for themselves, leaving little behind for the frontier troops. Small amounts were flown in by aircraft, submarine and barges, but supplies gradually got lower and lower. Despite this, they were ordered to hold on. They were blocking the coast road, which added to the British logistical issues, and several British units were now committed to sieging them. Rommel reported to Rome that the garrisons could not be supplied indefinitely, and suggested that they should be withdrawn to Crete in Italian warships, but this suggestion was dismissed by both the Italian and German high commands. On the 20th of December, RAF fighters began to operate from Chile. 7th Support Group reached Taruba and made contact with the rearguards of the Trieste and Arete divisions. On the 21st of December, the enemy moved from Taruba. 7th Support Group pursued, but they were slowed again by the weather and the lack of petrol. Gott decided to organise a Jock column from 7th Support Group, called Pepe's Column, and sent it towards Benina airfield. Ritchie received reports saying that a lot of the Axis fighter aircraft had gathered at El Magnon airfield. He therefore ordered Brigadier Marriott to take his brigade and advance towards it, if possible, that night. He then relinquished command of Marriott's brigade to 13th Corps. Godwin Austen then confirmed Marriott's current orders to take El Magron, and also ordered it to secure Agadabia and then El Agala, as well as patrol towards Marada. For this, Marriott's brigade would be supported by the armoured cars of the 12th Lancers and by 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment armed with M3 light tanks. 7th Support Group was to continue the advance along the coast road. It's worth noting that the rest of 7th Armoured Division was being withdrawn at this point. 1st Armoured Division had arrived, and the reconstituted 22nd Armoured Brigade, with 80 cruisers and 30 M3 lights, had already relieved most of 4th Armoured Brigade at Machili. By the evening, Marriott had one squadron of the 11th Hussars near Skeledima and one near Antalat. The Coldstream Guards were 15 miles east of Antalat, and the Scots Guards were near Massus. Meanwhile, 15th Panzer Division had reached Bedefom. 21st Panzer Division was at Gamines. The Italian Arete, Trieste and Pavia divisions were near El Abia. The Trento had reached Bars. The Brescia was at Torca, and the Africa Division, plus the Bologna, were at Agadabia. On the 22nd of December, Reed's Oasis Force had almost reached the coast. 7th Support Group received some fuel and now headed towards Massus and Antalat, reaching the area 15 miles south of Skeledima. 22nd Armoured Brigade prepared to set off from Machili towards Saunu. And Marriott sent a detachment towards El Magron, but this was held up at Skeledima. The 12th Lancers got delayed in the north. One company of the Coldstream Guards was sent towards Bedefom and another company was sent towards Agadabia. They were trying to cut the Germans and Italians off from escaping south, much like had happened during Operation Compass. Early in the morning of the 23rd of December, 3rd Battalion Royal Tank Regiment had joined the company of the Coldstream Guards at Bedefom. 15th Panzer Division now used the 22 new Panzers to blunt 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, forcing both British units to fall back to the area east of Antalat. When 7th Support Group appeared, the Germans withdrew. So yes, the British hadn't cut the coastal road, and all the Italian infantry divisions slipped away down the coast, except for the Brescia. Ritchie and Godwin Austen didn't realise that they'd failed. They thought that the bulk of the Italian divisions was still near Benghazi, but that simply wasn't the case. They issued orders for the next day, ordering 7th Support Group to clear the area between Benghazi and Antalat. Marriott and the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment were to take Agadabia, 22nd Armoured Brigade was to advance on the southern flank and encircle the enemy, and Reed's Oasis Force was ordered to cut the coast road as far south of Agadabia as it could. On the 24th, at Benina, Pepe's column saw and heard the demolitions going off at Benghazi harbour as the Axis forces began retreating. When the King's Dragoon Guards and Pepe's column entered the town, the place was in chaos, with several wrecked ships lying in the harbour. The rest of Axis forces at Benghazi slipped past the rest of 7th Support Group, with the Brescia Division bringing up the rear. Marriott moved a few miles towards Agadabia, and 22nd Armoured Brigade finally reached Saunu but then ran out of petrol. The Brescia Division reached Agadabia by evening, joining 20th Corps and the 2 Panzer Divisions. Yes, Rommel's retreat had succeeded. Gott also entered Benghazi on Christmas Eve, but thanks to Churchill's request for tanks, Gott's entire division was now withdrawn to Egypt. As he left, Gott gave his maps and notes on the campaign to Alan Moorhead, who would later go on to write the African Trilogy. 25th of December 1941. I opened my Christmas parcel in my caravan yesterday evening and was very pleased with the letters from you and Manfred and the presents. Some of it, like the bottle of champagne, I took straight across to the intelligence truck where I sat it over with the other officers. The night passed quietly, but the Italian divisions gave us a lot of worry. There are shocking signs of disintegration, and German troops are being forced to the rescue everywhere. The British were badly disappointed at Benghazi in neither cutting us off nor finding petrol and rations. Kruvel has been made a full Panzer General. He really deserves it. I'm up at the front every day, regrouping and organising our forces. I hope we now succeed in making a stand. By the evening of the 26th, it seemed likely that the Germans were going to make a stand. However, the British could tell that Rommel's units were now very weak, and the Italians in particular were very tired. So, Godwin-Austen decided to take this opportunity to strike. He ordered Marriott to attack that night, and ordered Scott Coburn to operate on the southern flank the next morning. But 22nd Guards Brigade was spread out over a large area. One of the battalions made a hastily prepared and difficult night march in the rain, then attacked unsuccessfully. The next day, 27th of December, Scott Coburn's armour did little on the flank of Marriott's attack, and Godwin-Austen's plan came undone. He therefore ordered that they prepare to try again on the 28th of December. At this time, 600 tons a day were coming into Tobruk, but even with this, the British were struggling to supply their troops. Desert convoys consumed a lot of petrol, so the Axis frontier garrisons were definitely doing their work. All the available transport was barely maintaining a small force at the front, and the front was now starved of petrol as well as other supplies. So there seemed little chance of a major attack against Rommel's forces. This is when complaints about the famous British 4-gallon tins began to be taken seriously, with some convoys losing as much as 40% of their petrol supplies through leakages alone. This was the reason they were nicknamed the Flimsy by the troops, because they were almost useless. By this point, 22nd Armoured Brigade was at Chor-es-Sufan, the 22nd Guards Brigade was north of Agadabia, and the Panzers were sighted south of Agadabia. Kruvel noticed the gap between the two British brigades, and suggested to Rommel that they could defeat each brigade in detail. Rommel agreed, and preparations were made for the attack the next day. On the 28th, the two panzer divisions attacked 22nd Armoured Brigade. Scott Coburn had 90 tanks, 35 M3 lights and 55 Crusaders. The panzer divisions had 60 tanks, with 44 Panzer IIIs and 4s. The Germans drove 22nd Armoured Brigade south across a wadi, inflicting 37 tank losses on the British. For this, the Germans lost 7 panzers destroyed. Kruvel now turned his attention to the 22nd Guards Infantry Brigade, but Marriott pulled his men back and both sides settled down for a couple of days. Rommel still planned to withdraw to El Agheila, but decided to fight at Agadabia for a little longer. This would allow the infantry time to rest, and he hoped to do further damage to the British. On the 30th of December, Kruvel's panzers struck again. 22nd Armoured Brigade, which by this time had moved to the Balanda airfields, was hit hard and lost 23 out of 62 British tanks, either destroyed or damaged. The Germans lost another 7. This action forced 22nd Armoured Brigade to withdraw and refit. Ritchie now had no choice but to try and gather a force sufficient enough to rout the Axis out of Agadabia. But rain and cold brought the battle to an end on the 31st. Rommel believed that the recent successes had secured his right flank and gave him a few days breathing space. But because of supply issues, he decided to fall back to Elegala anyway and use the lull to gather his strength. Meanwhile, at the frontier, things were beginning to heat up. The cruiser Ajax and the gunboat Aphis blasted the southern defences at Bardia. RAF bombers went in as well. Bahrain's 3rd South African Brigade and Hayton's 4th South African Brigade began their assault, and the fighting would continue for the next couple of days. Happy New Year, everybody! We've reached 1942. The South Africans continued to assault Bardia, and both air forces were now fatigued and suffering from maintenance issues, which reduced the effectiveness of any air support. However, it's worth noting that the first Kitty Hawks appeared in the desert this day. Up until this point, they'd been relying on Tomahawks, but the Kitty Hawks would prove to be a superior aircraft, although still not as all-rounded as the German 109s. On the 2nd of January, General Schmidt and his 7,000-strong force surrendered, having received approval from Rommel. The South Africans and British lost 139 killed and 295 wounded in this assault, but freed 1,171 British prisoners of war. And now it was the turn of the Halfaya sector. As the British forces prepared for this attack, Axis forces were bombarded and subjected to a propaganda campaign urging them to give in. On the 5th of January, the Germans and Italians now began concentrating on neutralising Malta. A heavy German air offensive against Malta began, which eased the supply situation for the Axis forces in North Africa. 2,300 tons of aviation fuel arrived in Tripoli on the 5th of January, boosting Axis air strength. Some British tanks had to be sent to Malta, where an invasion was expected. This prevented Auchinleck from continuing the advance to Tripoli, but Auchinleck now decided to leave Ritchie in charge of the 8th Army. He was satisfied with his performance and thought it best to keep him in charge rather than risk affecting morale at home and with the troops if he was removed from command. Of course, Ritchie would have 2 experienced corps commanders to advise him, and Auchinleck could always intervene if something bad happened. But perhaps another reason why Auchinleck chose to keep Ritchie on was because Auchinleck had enjoyed the 10 days of battle during Crusader, and this gave him the excuse he needed to intervene more often in battles. It seems that it was better to command troops than play at military diplomacy, which was the job of the Commander-in-Chief. With Ritchie, his old staff officer, as a kind of proxy, he could retain a close interest and control in the Western Desert battles while commanding-in-chief in Cairo. This arrangement had worked well in the closing stages of Crusader, why not in the future? The decision to retain Ritchie as 8th Army commander after Crusader was Auchinleck's second greatest error of judgment in the Middle East. Auchinleck's judgments of professional ability were too often coloured by his personal liking of the person concerned. His warm-heartedness and his sense of loyalty as a man sometimes betrayed him as a general. Crusader had been another man's battle, and Ritchie had not actually had to fight it. He now prepared for an advance towards Tripoli, even though he was advised to prepare a defence against Rommel. Axis rearguards withdrew on the 6th of January under the cover of a day-long sandstorm. The British followed and discovered that the enemy's new line stretched from Mersa Brega towards Bir es Surah and then went southwest to Sidi Tabet. The salt marshes and soft sand in the area made a natural defensive position. On the 11th of January, Cooper's 6th South African Brigade attacked Sollum, which surrendered on the 12th. The remaining Axis garrison was now cut off from the sea. The British began to plan for another attack to finish off the defenders, but the defenders were on the brink. Hungry, thirsty and out of ammunition, General de Georgis and Major Bach surrendered on the 17th of January 1942. And therefore, Operation Crusader is over. Thus, the British had succeeded in their object of clearing Cyrenaica of the enemy, though not by means of a rapid stroke as had been planned, but only after a long and costly struggle which consumed so many of their resources that by the time they reached the western end of Cyrenaica, their blow was spent. Clearly, Operation Crusader had achieved its goal of relieving Tobruk and pushing the Axis out of Cyrenaica. Rommel was now back where he had been before his first desert offensive, and he had suffered serious losses in men and material. However, the British also paid a heavy price. Total British manpower losses during Crusader were 17,700. This included half of the 1st South African Division and a significant portion of Freiberg's 2nd New Zealand Division, in addition to the British 70th Division in Tobruk, 7th Armoured Division and 13th Corps. The Germans suffer fewer casualties than the British at 14,600, but the Italians lose 23,700 for a total of 38,300 Axis casualties. And these numbers are just those lost during the battle. If we add in the frontier garrisons, another 13,800 Axis troops who surrender, then the total losses for the Axis is 52,100. Therefore, the British lose 17,700 and the Axis lose 52,100. Considering that the British had lost a good portion of their tank force, this ratio certainly makes up for it. Speaking of tank losses, the British lose 200 infantry tanks and 600 cruisers, for a total of around about 700 to 800. However, a good chunk of these are repaired, so overall losses were about 320. The Germans lose 220 panzers and the Italians about 120. These two figures are after their repairs had been made, so it's not possible to see what damage the British actually did. Either way, it's 340 Axis tank losses to 320 British. So, this victory was Pyrrhic in nature, since the British also suffered heavily and were weakened by their advance. Churchill was also up to his old tricks, taking forces from North Africa and moving them elsewhere, weakening the British when they could least afford it. And Ritchie was also left in charge of the British 8th Army. These factors would come to haunt them all soon enough. For many of you watching this series, at the beginning of the battle you were saying, yep, the British have lost this. And yet, the battle twisted and turned in unforeseen ways, and somehow the British won. Now we're going to try and understand why Operation Crusader really was an accidental victory, and ask, what was the most important factor that made Crusader go the way that it did, and who was to blame for this? Many historians will just list the reasons for the defeat or victory of a battle and then say, yeah, I'm done. And that's why history is boring. Yes, there's flawed theoretical reasons why they do this, which I'll get into in another video, but we're not interested in being boring. History really comes alive when you're fighting over the interpretation of the events. So, let's fight. I'm going to make a decision. I'll give you my reasoning too, and I want you guys to make a decision as well. So long as you've watched the full series, you're in a place to wade in here with your interpretation. Obviously, I'd recommend the books as well, and I'll leave some recommendations in the pinned comment, but watching the series will give you a pretty solid grounding. Anyway, let's create a debate, and let's have some civil discussions and arguments about it. Also, I just want to point out quickly that the way I'm structuring this video might catch a couple of you off guard. I'd really encourage you to watch the rest of the video before commenting, because I will be returning to points made in this section a little later, and you'll see why I do that. But overall, it's hard to argue with the idea that Crusader was only won because the Germans lost it. By the end of the first week, The British had abandoned their original plan, had lost most of their tank force, and were on the brink of collapse. Cunningham was wavering, and the decision to retreat was being contemplated. Then we go from this situation, the verge of an Axis victory, to total Axis defeat. How? I think it's important to ask why the Axis decided to fall back rather than why the British won, because we only have to worry about the factors that impact the Axis. There are several potential reasons, and we're going to go through them in turn. I'm also going to pick out the one that I think is the most important, but feel free to disagree with me. We're relying on interpretation here, so it's all good. First, Rommel isn't in command of all Axis forces, with Gambara's corps, the important Areti armoured and Trieste motorised divisions, not under his command. This leads to a dilution of Axis strength at critical times in the battle. This is actually one of the excuses that the Germans use to explain their defeat. We can sum it up by saying, blame the Italians. And it's true that Gambara's forces were needed, and having a united force makes a lot of sense. But when Gambara's forces were needed, the Germans gained them. The "where is Gambara" incident is the only exception. However, that was later on in the battle, arguably after it had been lost. And, in fact, at this point Gambara was cooperating with the Germans, and the reason he didn't turn up had nothing to do with the Axis command structure. Plus, even if he had turned up, it's hard to see how this would have been decisive. No, blaming the Italians is a poor excuse. We've seen this in this battle itself, that the Italians actually fought pretty hard. Many of their actions were ignored or distorted by the Germans or the British, with several actions being reported as German when they were in fact Italian. It also dismisses the massive mistakes that the Germans made, so no, it's not the reason for the Axis defeat. The next reason is Rommel's obsession with Tobruk. This causes problems, meaning that most of the infantry are committed to the siege lines and guarding the frontier, and are unable to assist in the battle being waged elsewhere. However, Rommel's obsession with Tobruk accidentally leads to the failure of the British plan, so technically this was a strength and a weakness. Not having the Italian units sat around Tobruk or on the frontier, and actually having them contribute to the battle, may have led to a better outcome, or it may have led to the British breaking out of Tobruk and causing more problems. It's also hard to see how a few less mobile and low manpower Italian infantry divisions could have turned the tide of the battle, so I don't think this led to the defeat of Axis forces. And then we come to the meat of the issues. First, Kruvel's poor tactics on Toten-Sonntag. Kruvel loses a significant portion of Axis strength in a cavalry-like charge against British and South African positions. Yes, they do win this engagement, but the cost was significant, and Rommel's subsequent dash to the wire downplayed the role that Kruvel's poor tactics played in this battle, meaning that some historians fail to pick up on this. But Kruvel's tactics result in heavy losses prior to the dash, and while the dash was bad, it perhaps wouldn't have been quite as bad had Kruvel not lost as many men and panzers as he did. It certainly didn't help the situation, and the subsequent shifting of the blame to Rommel downplays Kruvel's mistake. But, of course, Rommel's dash to the wire was bad. This was because it wasn't a stroll or a nice cruise, it was a hasty rush. This disorganised and exhausted his already tired and wounded forces, and after leaving the battlefield to the British, allowed 7th Armoured Division to repair itself so that when both sides met again a few days later, 7th Armoured Division was still in the fight and remained a constant thorn in Rommel's side. Many historians place the blame for the Axis loss on Rommel's dash, and for good reason. He had practically won the battle, at least versus 30 Corps, prior to this point. As Kruvel wanted to do, they They could have destroyed the remnants of 30 Corps and then sank their teeth into 13th Corps when they were less exhausted. But you can argue against this too. Rommel's dash to the wire almost worked, and it probably would have worked had Auchinleck not come to the rescue. Cunningham was on the verge of fleeing the field. If he had done so, we'd be saying how amazing Rommel's dash was. Plus, Rommel didn't realise that his forces were quite as badly damaged as they were as a result of Cruvel's poor tactics. Either way, the dash certainly changes the course of the battle, so yes, it could be the reason for the Axis defeat, and in hindsight, it makes sense to blame this. But there are other issues. The fight became an attritional fight where both sides had to pull in as many reinforcements as possible. It's true that the British were able to pull in more reinforcements than the Germans or Italians, who brought up none, but this only actually accounted to one full division, 2nd South African, and a few other brigades. And when you look at the retreat, you can see that many Axis divisions were retreating, followed only by a few British brigades. Technically, it's only 2 British divisions, 4th Indian and 7th Armoured Divisions plus additional brigades, but even these divisions weren't at full strength either. 4th Indian and 7th Armoured only had 2 brigades each, and there were 3 other brigades involved in the drive west, and even then these brigades had been fighting for a while. They weren't fresh forces. Yes, prior to this retreat, the British were trying to bring up additional forces, like Pienaar's brigade, but they mostly failed to do so, and Pienaar's situation is debatable, and we'll explore this in a follow-up video. The Axis failed as well, for whatever reason, to bring up Gambara, although I think the Germans were looking for excuses to blame the Italians and not admit their own faults here. So, while the British were receiving reinforcements, it's hard to say that this was the decisive factor, simply because they didn't bring up that many reinforcements and didn't overwhelm the Axis with sheer numbers. And when they did bring up additional forces, this was later in the battle. The tide of the battle changed during the period when the British weren't bringing up additional forces, so this is only a contributing factor to the defeat, not the cause of the defeat itself. Finally, Axis logistics and supplies ultimately forced the Axis to retreat until their supply situation was fixed, which caused the British to outstretch their own supply lines, forcing the battle to come to an end. This is related to factors like Malta, Lend-Lease trucks, tanks, and Libyan ports and so on, but ultimately the British had more supplies and better logistical circumstances than the Axis, although not enough to secure total victory in North Africa at this stage. Thinking objectively, between attrition and this, logistics has more weight to it. The Axis are simply not able to get enough supplies across the Mediterranean and are starved. When you look at what Rommel's saying at the time, he's begging Mussolini to sort out the supply situation. He's critical of Cavallero and Montezemolo when they bring him news of the dreadful supply crisis, and his fuel and ammunition stocks are depleted to the point that he doesn't know if he can actually retreat or not. The British, on the other hand, are, for the most part, able to bring up supplies. It's arguable, but I'd say that logistics is probably the main reason why Rommel retreats from Tobruk and Gazala more than anything else. However, this is at the end of the battle. In the first couple of weeks, Rommel has enough supplies, and if he had won the battle then, which he may have been able to do prior to the dash, then in theory logistics may not have forced him to retreat. So, is logistics the main factor? It's obviously a big factor, especially towards the end, once the fight became attritional, but it's hard to argue that this was the reason for the British win or the Axis loss. Having gone through the factors, For me, it's hard to get away from the idea that the Germans won the battle initially, but then lost it either on or around Totensuntag or in Rommel's subsequent dash to the wire. In hindsight, and from purely the German perspective, it's obvious that Rommel's dash was a very bad move. His forces were weakened, he raced off and disorganised them further, and it allowed the British to recover. As mentioned, many historians blame this too and point the finger at Rommel. A few also look at Crüwell's actions on Totensuntag. Well, here's my thoughts on this. Crüwell was a contributing factor, but it was Rommel's stubbornness that led to the dash. The dash, and let's not forget that it could have worked, which we'll come back to, was the turning point of the battle. In hindsight, and from the German perspective, it was absolutely the biggest mistake of the battle. So if we're looking for a reason as to why the Axis lost the battle, Rommel's dash to the wire is the one we must blame, perhaps with Crüwell's contribution there as well. However, hindsight is what forces us to say this, and while it may be the reason why the Axis lost, we're forgetting that the dash almost worked, and it certainly wasn't the reason why the battle ended up the way it was. So while we can conclude that this was probably the reason the Axis lost, there's a lot more to it than just this. And I think the best way to explain this is to ask this question: why was Crusader an accidental victory? From the British perspective, what was the most important factor that made Operation Crusader the accidental victory that it was? Because I think it's fair to say that the British almost lost this battle. And yes, I think you can make an argument for any of the factors that I'm about to say, but let's run through them. The British had an impatient Prime Minister, constantly demanding the attack start yesterday when the British perhaps weren't fully prepared. Well, Churchill certainly had an impact, and perhaps the British could have been better prepared, but let's not forget that if they'd waited any longer, Rommel may have attacked Tobruk and destroyed Scobie's 70th Division and taken the port, which would have eased Axis supply problems. Therefore, even if the battle was waged prematurely, it makes sense to launch it when it was. Plus, the British 8th Army was prepared. Yes, it could have been more prepared, but you could always have more health, or more freedom, or more intelligence. There's no limit to any of these things. There's no limit to the amount that an army can be prepared. When is an army prepared? When it has 1 million men? Or a bazillion? And it did win the battle even in the state that it was in. Plus, we have to remember that Churchill was thinking strategically, not operationally or tactically. Yes, he adversely affects the battle, but he does so because he knows that the British Empire is bankrupt, and that the Soviets are in trouble, and that the United States has to be persuaded to be in the war. And when Japan gets involved, he has to ship units to the Far East to sort that crisis out. Arguably, he may not have had much choice about these decisions. But either way, while Churchill was a factor, I don't think that Churchill is the most important factor for the way that Crusader turned out. Although, yes, it could be argued that he was still wrong to do what he did because of its impact on the operational level. The second factor is that the British had a poor officer corps which wasn't using a combined arms doctrine. This meant that the tanks would fight independent from the infantry and anti-tank guns, handing the Germans the advantage on the tactical level. Barnett is super critical here of what he called the gentry and aristocracy. Therefore, in a true sense, most regular officers of the British Army were amateurs as well as gentlemen, born into the gentry or the aristocracy, spending their lives in the last sanctuary of privilege in Europe. Their mental characteristics and morality were not surprisingly very different from those of the managers, the scientists, and the technicians of industry. Cleverness, push, ruthlessness, self-interest, and ambition were considered less prized than modesty, good manners, courage, a sense of duty, chivalry, and certain affectation of easygoing non-professionalism. Barnett has a point, although probably takes it a bit too far. But as much as the doctrines and officers were flawed, these factors only affect the tactical level. If you think this battle was won or lost at the tactical level, so battalion or brigade level, then yes, this makes a lot of sense. However, this is related to the next 2 points. The British had inadequate guns and equipment, which meant that the Germans had the tactical advantage, and it also exacerbated the failure to implement a combined arms doctrine. The previous 2 points also influenced the splitting of the tanks from the infantry at the corps level, meaning that 30 Corps, the force expected to win the main fight, had little to no artillery and infantry support. But it really is a question of whether you think this battle was won at the tactical level or not. And I think you can certainly argue this, but I don't think it was. When you read the books, authors tend to focus on the lower levels because it's easier than explaining what's going on operationally. And when books do explain this, it tends to end up being quite dry or overwhelming. David Glance's books are awesome, but they're not always an easy read. This is, in fact, the disadvantage of reading books. You can't visualise all the hundreds, if not thousands, of units on a battle and where they are, etc. That's why history videos are super important. They allow you to visualise the battles. This is actually one of the big motivational factors for me to make these type of videos. I have a good imagination, but I can't imagine every single unit or see the complete flow of the battle all in my head, especially one this complicated. Visuals like these take this to the next level, even if they are a time-consuming process to make. The end result is worth it though, for seeing the operational level, which you can't always get in the books, especially ones with few maps or poor maps, which is most of the ones on this battle. So the focus in the books on this battle in particular has been on the tactical level and on concepts that are easier for the readers to understand. But it's clear by looking at the operational level here in this video that this wasn't won or lost at the tactical level, as some of the books suggest that it was. Yes, the British did lose more in their engagements with the Germans, but they were usually outnumbered at the operational level because of their mishandling of the entire operation. According to the original plan, they really shouldn't have been outnumbered in these engagements, and yet they were. And this comes down to the plan. The British plan was flawed. The first day went well, but at that point the plan fell apart completely and had to be abandoned. And this was because Operation Crusader relied on Rommel reacting to the British advance to Gabra-Saleh, which he didn't. The British were left scratching their heads and started sending their tank brigades in all directions, trying to figure out what to do next. When the decisive tank battles did occur, British strength was diluted enough that the Axis won them. This is perhaps the most important factor as to why the British lost the early part of the battle. The other factors like the weapons and doctrines only gave the Germans an advantage on the tactical level, but things started going wrong before the British had even met the Germans in battle. The Germans were able to react at their leisure and defeat the separated British tank brigades in turn. Within the first week, 30 Corps was defeated, Cunningham was wavering, and the Axis dominated the battlefield. And I think this would have happened even if the British doctrines and equipment had been better. Handing the enemy the initiative, failing to have a backup plan when he didn't do what you wanted him to do, splitting your forces, failing to concentrate when needed, and ultimately abandoning the plan in favour of a let's just see what happens mentality, clearly led to the vast majority of the problems within the battle itself. I also think this is why the battle lasted as long as it did. Any other plan would have seen the decisive battles required to either gain victory or defeat. The British failed to land the decisive punch in the beginning, and indeed never did. Both sides ended up just slapping each other until one side got tired and then stepped back. Yes, technically a victory, but it took far longer and at greater cost than it could have been if the British had hit hard in the beginning. The plan itself prevented that initial punch at the operational level. So, in my opinion, the flawed plan was an important factor. But there are other factors. You have a British command crisis whereby Cunningham thought he'd lost and wanted to withdraw, leading to his replacement in the middle of the battle and all the problems that caused. The problem is that the previous factors led to the British command crisis, not the other way around. Yes, without the British command crisis you couldn't have got a victory, and it certainly impacted the battle. However, I don't think this was what made the battle go the way it did. The confusion the command crisis brought about only really happened after everything had gone wrong. So, when we look at all these factors, it's clear that the biggest one is the Crusader plan itself. The Crusader plan messes everything up, meaning that it should have been a British defeat. But then we know that Rommel and/or Cromwell mess up, leading to the Axis defeat. So which is more important? And who's at fault for the way this battle turned out? If the British plan was at fault, there can only really be one person to blame. Cunningham created the plan. Cunningham put that plan in motion, Cunningham's plan failed, and Cunningham became disillusioned by the outcome, wanting to retreat. Really then, it was Cunningham who turned Crusader into the chaotic mess of a battle that it was. And I don't think anyone else could be blamed for the plan. Yes, Churchill had forced the British to fight this prematurely, but they were somewhat prepared when they started it. Yes, generals like Gott, Norrie, Pienaar all made mistakes or caused problems, but they were a symptom, not the cause. Ultimately, the plan was fundamentally flawed. Let's drive into the desert, nowhere near where the enemy is, and wait for him to react, and then have no backup plan in case he doesn't react. Just saying it out loud makes it sound stupid, and that plan was Cunningham's plan. The plan went wrong almost immediately, and quickly led to the defeat of the British armour in 30 Corps. Cunningham must take responsibility for this. The reasons why Cunningham's plan ended up being so poor, or whether Cunningham was freaking out or not by the time he was sacked, are up for debate. But nobody's defending the Cunningham plan. Historians explain why Cunningham made it the way it was, and they offer alternatives like Norrie's idea of going straight for Sidi Rezai rather than Gabra-Saleh, but nobody's defending the actual plan. When the British got into fights with the Germans, their tank doctrine, or lack of combined arms warfare, put them at a disadvantage, but this battle wasn't won or lost on the tactical scale. The movement of the divisions and brigades was what won or lost this battle, and that operational level direction of the battle was a direct result of the initial plan. And Cunningham made that plan. Therefore, Cunningham must take full responsibility for the poor performance of the British at the beginning of the battle, and it's no wonder he was sacked. But then you could also say, at the beginning of the battle, Rommel and Cromwell had pretty much won it. The British plan was flawed, and they had the opportunity to wipe out the remaining units of 30 Corps while they were weak. If they'd done that, victory, although not guaranteed, was a possibility, and yet they didn't do it. Instead, Rommel decided to leave 30 Corps alone and instead make a dash to the wire, which diluted his strength, achieved nothing, and allowed 30 Corps to recover. Rommel is a good general. There's no denying that fact, and he will go on to beat the British several more times before El Alamein. But good generals aren't flawless. They make mistakes, and leaving the battlefield to go on a cruise around the desert wasn't a good strategy. When Rommel re-entered the battlefield, he had lost the advantage and the initiative that he'd gained early on, and the battle turned into an attritional fight that the Axis, with poor sea communications, could not win. Or at least, that's what many historians argue. But let's not forget Crüwell. Crüwell survived the battle and the war, and was able to influence our perception of the battle. Crüwell's handling of the panzer divisions on Totensuntag was poor, and yet the blame for the loss of the German side was shifted to Rommel and his dash to the wire, which came after Totensuntag. So, did Crüwell's performance weaken the panzer divisions prior to the dash, and thus was the determining factor that led to the defeat? Or was the dash still a bad idea? Well, many historians do think the dash was a bad idea, but I'm not so sure. The fact is, Rommel's dash to the wire almost worked. Had Auchinleck not been there, it may have worked. Cunningham was on the verge of ordering a retreat, and it was Auchinleck who steadied him. Had this not happened, Cunningham may have started a withdrawal, causing them to lose the battle. So, the dash was actually a good strategy. And this is the crucial element that people forget about this battle. The dash almost worked. So the only reason we blame it is because we know it didn't work. And that is hindsight speaking. Plus, as many people have pointed out to me in the comment sections of these videos, the other option, destroying the 7th Armoured Division, may not have made any difference. The Axis would have been in a very similar situation. Yes, 7th Armoured Division would be gone, but 2nd New Zealand Division with 1st Army Tank Brigade attached is still around. And whereas German forces were exhausted on their dash, they would have been just as exhausted and would have suffered more casualties had they tackled 7th Armoured Division directly. So some argue that regardless of what Rommel did here, he was going to lose. This is obviously up for debate, and we're dipping our toes into alternative history here, which is dangerous territory. And as this battle shows, history never goes the way we'd imagine it. We can't predict that Rommel would still lose if he took out 7th Armoured Division, nor can we say that he would have won. But it would be fair to conclude that Rommel's best chance of winning this battle would be to force the British to withdraw within a day or two after Totensuntag. Would destroying 7th Armoured Division have made this happen? We must consider the fact that 7th Armoured Division was practically destroyed anyway. The tank battle Cunningham had hoped to have fought had been lost, so again it's hard to see how destroying 7th Armoured Division would result in a British withdrawal. The dash to the wire brought Rommel very close to realising that goal. The alternative may not have caused Cunningham to panic or retreat. Despite its flaws, the dash was perhaps the best decision Rommel could have made in those circumstances. Yes, this is a controversial opinion going against many of the historians, but I think it has merits. The Axis cannot win an attritional battle. Fighting and destroying 7th Armoured Division would have led to higher casualties and would have exhausted the Axis mobile divisions, much like the dash did anyway. They then probably wouldn't have been in a position to win the battle. At best, they would have been in a similar situation. The only way they could actually win this battle would be to cut British forces off from their supplies, which Freyberg's division was as a result of the dash, and then force the British to withdraw. The dash came very close to making that a reality. Defeating the remnants of an already beaten 7th Armoured Division may not have achieved this. If the dash was the best course of action, or at least the alternative to the dash wasn't viable, then Rommel really isn't at fault here. and that's when Cruvel comes back into the spotlight. His poor performance on Toten Suntag hurts the Axis significantly. If the only way the Axis can win is by beating the enemy without resorting to an attritional fight, then Rommel's dash is good, and Cruvel's mishandling of the panzer divisions is bad. After the battle, Cruvel shifts the blame for the high Axis casualties from himself to Rommel's dash. But this ignores the fact that Rommel is trying to find a decisive, non-attritional solution to win the battle. So maybe it is Cruvel, with his high losses, who should take more of the blame here. And what this also means is that the Axis's best chance was to cause Cunningham to panic. The only chance they would have to do that was with Rommel's dash. And Rommel could only make the dash if the early parts of the battle had been so badly mishandled that the Axis win the tank battle at the beginning. They were able to win this, which suggests that the plan was the main factor in why Crusader became the accidental victory that it was. If the British had kept their armour together and headed off to Sidi Rezai, as Norrie suggested, then the plan would have been more decisive. Whether it would have been a victory or defeat, we'll never know, but in its current form, the plan wasn't decisive. It was a complete mess. The subsequent problems, the swirling confusion of the battle, and Rommel's chance of even making his dash to the wire was as a direct result of the flaws in the original plan. And for that, Cunningham is the only one who can take the blame for this. It was his plan, he compromised and decided to hand the initiative to Rommel, and when that didn't result in the Axis reacting the way that he had hoped, he allowed the armour to split up and get destroyed piecemeal. The plan was the first domino, and the mess that followed was as a direct result of Cunningham dropping that domino. So who's to blame for the mess that was Operation Crusader's accidental victory? Lieutenant General Sir Alan Cunningham. Crusader was an important battle. It was the first major tank battle in the North African campaign, the first battle for the new 8th Army, and Rommel's first defeat. In fact, this was the first British victory against German land forces in the war. But most people haven't even heard of the battle. And there's several reasons why. It wasn't a decisive British victory, nor was it total. The Axis had been pushed back to where they'd been when Rommel had first landed, but they hadn't been kicked out of Libya. Technically, only one Axis division had been destroyed, the Savona, an Italian one, and while the Germans had lost a lot, the British had also lost a lot too. Even Auchinleck admitted that this victory had taken longer and cost them more than he had expected. It was also overshadowed by events on the Eastern Front and in the Far East, plus what happened later at El Alamein, so the British certainly didn't have a lot to say about this battle. From the Axis point of view, Crusader was a loss for Rommel. And since there's a lot of Rommel fans out there, many don't want to talk about his defeats when they can get away with it. And in this case, they can get away with it, because the British have largely forgotten about this battle as well. We also have to consider that the gains from this victory were lost shortly afterwards. The Germans counterattack and end up back at Gazala. Therefore, Crusader wasn't a decisive operation, and many people aren't interested in battles that aren't decisive. This comes down to human nature. People want to know about the turning points of the war, and Crusader wasn't a turning point, even though it perhaps could have been. Much like the victory from the previous winter, Operation Compass, Operation Crusader has slipped into obscurity for the same reasons. There's also the fact that Crusader is stupidly complicated. It's not an easy story to tell. And when you look at the literature, many of the books don't do this battle justice. They are too thin, they're too wishy-washy, some just skip over it completely, and many that don't miss massive amounts of information out. And I can totally understand this. This is probably one of the most complicated, non-linear battles in history. So many authors and readers skip past it to the battles after this, and that's perhaps understandable. But it really should be known by more people. It is important, not just because it was the first defeat of Rommel or the Germans, but because of its impact on the North African campaign. I don't want to spoil too much, but by the end of Crusader, Rommel's forces had recovered enough, and British forces were weak enough, that Crüwell was able to fight a decent defensive battle at Agadabiya. Was there a potential for another Axis attack in the future? One day we will see. Thanks for watching, thanks for supporting, bye for now.